In Reykjavik in August 2012, I came across a headline in the city's English language newspaper, The Grapevine, which read, "Woman takes part in search for herself." The rest of the story went like this. A woman described as Asian, 160 centimeters tall, wearing dark clothing, speaks English well, was reported missing from her bus tour in South Iceland. The woman in question didn't recognize this description as herself, so she joined in the search. A few days later, it occurred to her that she might be the missing woman, and it turned out to be so. Apparently, the bus driver had made a mistake in the head count, and since she changed her clothing and her hairstyle on their break, her fellow travelers hadn't recognized her, and someone had reported her as missing. At that point, we had been in Iceland for 3 weeks. As a fellow Asian woman, I felt a kinship with this woman in the story. Who was she? What was going through her mind as she joined in the search? Did she do so just because she was a compassionate person, or was she worried about this other Asian woman who was lost in the wilderness? Were there other Asian women on the tour, or was she the only one and somehow didn't notice? Had the truth dawned on her suddenly, or had she been kind of having doubts all along? Maybe they got her height wrong and she didn't think that was her. Maybe she was actually 165 centimeters tall, like me. Maybe she was wearing a blue jacket and didn't think it qualified as dark clothing. Or maybe she actually didn't speak English well, which would explain a lot. More than anything, this woman's predicament made me wonder just how much of an impression a traveler can expect to leave on her surroundings. And how can she know how she's seen by the people with whom she's mingling? 4 months prior to this, my husband Eric and I left the San Francisco Bay Area to travel the world. We had no itinerary and no end date, just portable careers and a desire to change the scenery. I had not been much of a foreign traveler up until this point. I had spent my entire life in California, where I still live, and all of this was in the Bay Area, except for 5 years in LA as a grad student. Until a week-long trip to Hong Kong when I was 28, I hadn't even known if I would like international travel. Since I hadn't been anywhere, I saw it as really risky and frightening. You know, you had to get vaccinations and practice languages and all that stuff. I didn't know where to start. But I had loved Hong Kong when we went, and Taiwan the year after. So when Eric said, you know, we don't have to be tied to any one place, we should just take our lives on the road, I said, okay. Less than half a year after that, we had given up our lease, and all of our possessions were in storage or with family and friends, and we were on our way. We started in Toronto because it seemed easy. It was, you know, linguistically, culturally, geographically close-ish to home. We had family friends there, and we spent the first week of our trip with them. It could not have been a more comfortable start, but even so, after arrival, my habitual self-consciousness made itself felt. Could everyone tell I was new? In Toronto, the architecture looked different. The chain stores were different. There were unfamiliar $1 and $2 coins. I dressed carefully in the clothes I liked at home, but out in the heart of the city, when I caught sight of my reflection in shop windows or restroom mirrors, I felt really dowdy. The Bay Area is not super into fashion, so I felt like I could ignore it. But out in the hip areas of Toronto, I just felt like a complete dork. Let's see. People were nice, but they didn't make eye contact or smile, which I have since learned is fairly common for big cities. But I felt suburban and totally rebuffed. I had never before lived in a pedestrian-friendly city where every outing became a chance to compare myself unfavorably with all the people around me. As the weeks went by, the differences between Canada and the US no longer seemed enormous. I got new jeans and a new purse, and I sweated my way through the humidity. I went to vintage shops, Portuguese Italian bakeries. I bought fiddlehead ferns and ramps at the Dufferin Grove Farmers Market, injera from an Ethiopian and Eritrean deli, and custard buns, far too many, from the 2 Korean bakeries within half a mile of where we stayed. We made some friends, and Toronto began to feel like home, and we talked of moving there after we ended our travels. And then we ended up in Montreal, which was totally different, and I'm going to stop there. But this was our travels, basically. We would just go to a place and maybe not know where we were going after that, or at least not know where we were going several months after that. I found out I was a completely self-conscious person, which I didn't fully appreciate until we got to new place after new place after new place. And in each place, I had this same experience of hunkering down for a few days and being like, I can't go out. I'm so new. And then going out and seeing everybody and being like, they're all looking at me. They're looking at my clothes. They're like looking at the way I move. They know I'm not from here. And then by the end of maybe a month or even a few weeks, I would start feeling really comfortable. And after we'd traveled for a couple of years, I started to realize that's just me. And I'm going to be like that wherever I am. And sure enough, when we came back to the Bay Area, we moved into an apartment in Oakland. The first time I went to the post office, this woman was rude to me, and I was like, it's because she can tell I'm new. It's just who I am.
All right. Well, could you tell us a little bit? I know there's some drawings up here on the screen.
Yeah. So does this come off? Probably. So this is in Edinburgh, which was the third place we went after Toronto. And I had just gone out on the street and was sketching some people, which was a thing. I mean, I'm a self-conscious person, as I'm saying. I was kind of nervous about sketching with people walking around me because, if you don't want to be looked at, if you're drawing, people are going to look at you. But they don't look as much as I thought. This is also Edinburgh. This is up on a hill. Behind me is a famous hill called Arthur's Seat that you can climb up. And yeah, Reykjavik, jazz festival, I think. Fun time to draw people because they're not looking at you. This was like an indie music festival in Reykjavik. That band is called Hide Your Kids. This lady was from Sweden, and she was wearing this amazing, gigantic, strange garment, and I kept trying to draw it. This is in Istanbul. The park is called Gülhane. It's next to Topkapı Palace, and it's really cool. This is also Istanbul. There's a famous pedestrian shopping street, and I'm up like on a mall balcony looking down. Is that it? I thought there was one more. No? Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. This is the Yeni Cami, which means new mosque, new in this case because it's Istanbul, is 17th century. And I just sat there and sketched it for a while. Family's gossiping next to me. I assume they were gossiping.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your writing activities. I know you belong to some writing groups for women of color, and there have been reports about the publishing industry and its diversity problem. And I was wondering, how does that affect you as a writer and your craft in particular?
Ooh, when I think about writing as a person of color, writing as a woman, I do feel that no matter what I'm writing, it's political. Even if it's not overtly political, even if I'm just writing about my life, which I usually am. Because there are mainstream narratives that we get usually, and I'm not in them. Or people who, there aren't as many people who look like me who are in them. And so I feel like just putting myself out there and being who I am, and being present and saying, I also have stories to tell, is a political act. And I've become a little bit more political the more I've seen what happens with other writers of color. Being in writer of color communities, I've heard so many stories. Like, I personally have been very lucky. I've had writing instructors of color, or people who are very supportive. Nobody has ever told me, the story that you're telling is not the story we want to hear. But I've heard so many of my friends in writing programs say things like, oh my gosh, there's just so many stories. Let's see. People being told that there was someone who had a lot of Tagalog words in her story, and I think there was a fellow student in her MFA program who said that he was just not interested in reading these words or trying to get into that world, even though this is her world and a world that exists in the world. I've heard of writers submitting novel manuscripts to publishing houses, and the publishers tell them things like, well, we already have a Chinese story this year, so we're not going to publish your book. And I hear a lot of stories like that, and it's really upsetting because the world is such a diverse place, and that's not always reflected in the kind of arts, culture, and media that is available to us. It's not even like people aren't reading these stories, but there are just certain stories that are being told over and over again, and certain stories that are not even out there. And I feel really strongly about it. And that's also why this book is really cool and independent publishing is really cool, because it raises up some of these voices so that they can be heard by a larger audience, and eventually they'll end up shaping what we think of as the mainstream narrative and stories that should be told. Hopefully, eventually what we can read and consume will actually end up reflecting what the world looks like.
Right.